Hey guys, Jeremy here from menzigaming.net. Welcome to my most recent video, kind of a tactica video, but today's video is going to look at a lot of the behind the scenes thinking processes that go into building an army and playing on the tabletop with Warhammer 40k. So the title of this video is Emotions and Economics in Competitive 40k. And the reason why I say that and juxtapose those two kind of concepts is because I feel a lot of people, especially even people at the top tables, and I think that's a really important preface for this video, is that a lot of people, when they kind of see this title and start watching it, I feared that they might think that I'm targeting kind of lower kind of beginners or people that are new to the hobby or new to the game. That's not necessarily true. I actually think that everybody can benefit from kind of like curtailing their emotions and improving their economical style, kind of rational style thinking when they're building their armies and playing games. So what's this video going to be about? It's going to be about, as I just said, removing emotion, minimizing emotion, and maximizing our rational thinking. And I'm going to use some economic style terms when I move on to discuss that kind of rational style thinking. So firstly, why should we remove emotion when we play 40k? Well, there's nothing wrong with emotion. You know, emotions kind of like defines what we are as humans, and it's a really important part of who we are. But sometimes emotional decisions can cloud what is the optimized play or optimized list building decision. And I've kind of got a few points here about how that can happen. So the first one in the list is favorite units. And that's kind of speaks for itself. A lot of people have favorite units. Sometimes these are units that they like because of the fluff. They really like the story of a unit. The perfect example of a unit people that love based on their story is might be someone like Drago or someone like Dante. It just so happens that those models are pretty good. But sometimes people get attached to units that aren't so good. So an example of that might be, I'm just trying to think of a codex I play. Well, I've been looking a lot. I play a lot of Eldar. I've been playing a lot of Eldar over the last 6 months in 8th edition. Somebody might get really attached to a model like their Wraith Knight. Like maybe they got a Wraith Knight commission painted and they watched the Dawn of War, the recent Dawn of War trailer, and just really loved the fact that the Wraith Knights are these massive things, these really cool things, but despite their size, they're really kind of live and agile. And somebody gets a Wraith Knight commission painted or paints up an awesome Wraith Knight. They want to use it in 8th edition. Well, Wraith Knights aren't good in 8th edition. They really aren't. So if you want to use that favorite unit, you're going to be compromising your efficacy on the tabletop. And sometimes people make that decision like fully rationally and they totally understand what they're doing. They say, you know what, I know that this unit of this Wraith Knight is not great, but I'm going to take it anyway because I want to try it and I like it, blah, blah, blah. That's fair enough. But sometimes the decisions are a little bit more clouded. And that moves to our second point, which is the small sample size events. So an example of this is when somebody will take a specific unit to a tournament or play a kind of a somewhat competitive game with a friend, and a unit will overperform in that game. So you take a unit that might not be very good, and it will just exceed what it's supposed to do. It might pass way more saves than statistically average. It might roll way more damage than it should. Maybe it just has a really good influence on the game based on that specific, very kind of niche dynamic of the game. And I'm not going to give a specific example here because there's so many ways in which this could happen. But these small sample size events, a lot of people will emotionally gravitate to that because they want to believe the outcome. So if you take that unit of Terminators, it might be just like tactical Terminators to a tournament, and everyone kind of says, don't take them, they're not good, take something else instead. You take those Terminators, they perform really well, and then you, based on that very small sample size, and it might only be in a couple of games they perform well, you then kind of validate your preconceived or you know, the notion that you wanted to believe that they are good. So as a result of a small sample size, I guess you're attaching yourself to a false belief. And that is something that is an emotional decision. It's an emotional occurrence there. And that's something that you should try to remove. So if something happens, even though it might be really positive and you might be really happy, maybe test things a few more times or run the numbers through your head and try to work out whether that unit of Terminators really should have dropped and killed, you know, 5, I don't even know what they would have killed, like 5 Beasts of Nurgle or some like ridiculous outcome that they should not achieve, and they happen to do it. Well, was that going to happen? Is that going to happen again and again? Could something else have done that just as well? So that's another emotional decision that I think people should avoid. Don't attach yourself to small sample size events. An extreme example of that is when somebody's kind of like commander will perform really well, or a unit will perform really well in a battle. People will like, you know, and they really like doing it, like take that model and like promote it. They'll repaint it, maybe they'll just substitute it with a totally new model, and then that'll be their new commander. And that's like a narrative and emotional element of 40k that's really good, but that can certainly, as I said, cloud the way in which we build our armies effectively. Excuse me. The third thing I want to talk about with emotion in 40k is the nerf effect. The nerf effect is when, because something's been changed for the negative, people feel like that unit is now damaged goods, or it is now bad because it's been nerfed, and they don't want to take it anymore. An example like this might be something like Storm Ravens, that recently have had a points hike from the chapter approved book that came out at the end of last year. People might feel, well, I'm now paying 20 or so points or 30 points more for a Storm Raven, so as a result of that, I shouldn't take it anymore. Now, that's not a reason unto itself to not take a Storm Raven. Of course, something like a Fire Raptor is just in many ways better than a Storm Raven for a cheaper cost or the same cost, so that is a good reason to not take a Storm Raven. But a lot of people will not take something just because of the psychological effect that it's been nerfed. So an example might be with Dark Reapers. We are expecting them to get nerfed in the FAQ. If they do get nerfed, that doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to be a trash unit. They might still be very good. They might still be worth taking. But a lot of people, when they get nerfed, or if they get nerfed, will be so kind of emotionally traumatized by that, or they'll feel like, well, I wasn't on the train when Dark Reapers were overpowered, so stuff them, I'm not going to bother getting them now. And this is something that certainly affects a lot of games, a lot of competitive games, the nerf effect. I think in some ways it affects other games more than 40k. Things like collectible card games, where if a card gets changed, if a card gets adjusted, people will just not want to use that card, they'll sell their card or whatever. So that's some reasons, some ways in which emotions can really cloud our judgment when it comes to building armies. And I think that we should try our best not to take it personally. When someone says, you know, remove your emotions in 40k, it's really easy to say, well, stuff you, you know, I'm not emotional, I just like this unit. Well, that's an emotional reaction. I think ultimately, in order to be really, to build the best possible army, we should be not thinking about what those models are and what they represent. We should be thinking about the way in which they interact and act on the tabletop. And this is, of course, assuming we have a super competitive mindset. If we're just playing for fun, disregard everything I'm saying regarding this. Okay, so now I'm going to move to some economic terms to help us think about 40k and to, I guess, really help list building, more so necessarily than on the table decisions. Now, excuse me, I've had a cold recently, so the first one I want to talk about is efficiency. And efficiency is an economic term, but it's also a term that we just use in general kind of life anyway. So I wanted to start with the term of efficiency. Efficiency is something that's probably the easiest and most relatable way to enter a discussion about economics, because we all understand and know what efficiency means. Someone says to you, hey, what do you think's more efficient at clearing Horde? A Grey Knight Strike Marine with a Storm Bolter, or a Space Marine Devastator with a las cannon? Well, you know, just in your head, you know that the Grey Knight is more efficient. And why do you know that? Well, you know that because the Grey Knight has 4 shots and they're strength 4 and they're more suited towards killing Horde versus the las cannon. So you're intuitively doing the mathematics in your head. You know straight away the maths. You know that the Grey Knight is better. And that's an intuitive kind of call. Even though it's based in efficiency style mathematics, you just know it to be true. But sometimes decisions will be kind of against what you would expect, or sometimes decisions will be so close mathematically that you can't just rely on your intuition. You actually have to crunch the numbers. And that's something that some people, they just don't let that come into play. And that's something that I think can really help us improve at 40k. To when we're considering efficiency, look beyond our intuition and our instinct and say, okay, well, we know a las cannon's not as good as a Storm Bolter, but what about tactical Marines? Would it be better to have 2 tactical Marines or 3 tactical Marines versus 2 strike Marines? Well, we know the strike Marines put out more shots, but what about what happens when the return fire happens? We start thinking about a couple of steps in a more complex equation. And analyzing complex equations is a really important part of improving at 40k. And I think that the best way to do it, and if you are trying to get into the idea of thinking mathematically about 40k, is to start with very small and simple examples. Don't go from, you're not going to go from, just starting out to being, Stephen Hawking level genius, phenom. You've got to kind of build your way up when you're doing these mathematical calculations. And a good way is to use something like an Excel spreadsheet, which I used in a previous video when I analyzed Dark Reapers. Using something like a calculator or a spreadsheet can really just help understand the equations as you're doing them. And those stats will stay there on the page for you. So you don't have all these things going through your head that you're forgetting, and you can't remember what your previous thing was. Write them down, work it out. What gun is better? Like an example is a lot of people I think I don't have this data prepared, but a lot of people recently have been talking about Necrons because Necrons are about to get released. And people are discussing the different Necron weapons, because some of the best Necron unit types, and a good example of this is the Necron bikes. They have access to 3 different weapons. So they have the Tesla, they have the Gauss, and they have their particle beamers, I think they're called. And all those 3 weapons have quite different profiles, but they're all in a way similar. They're all at a similar strength value, and they're kind of interacting in a kind of similar role. So if you're thinking about what weapon to take, rather than just intuitively say, well, I think that the Tesla seems better, or I think that the Gauss seems better because it's rapid fire and I'm going to push them forward, well, just sit down and do the maths. Input a different toughness values, different armor saves, and see how the weapons interact with the different values. And you might find that one weapon is just better across the board. And if that's the case, that's probably the one you should take. So that's our first point. The second point is a more kind of niche economic term, which is the concept of diminishing marginal utility. Once again, a bit of a mouthful. And for people that don't know what this means, this is referring to the idea that if you have a specific good or service or something like that, a productive thing, for every extra one of those things you have, it's going to give less benefit to you than the first one. So an example of that might be if you have a restaurant, and in that restaurant you have a toaster when you're toasting sandwiches and stuff like that. That first toaster you have is really important because you need that toaster to make toast. If you have another toaster, that's pretty good because if you get lots of toast orders, you're going to have that extra toaster to run it through. But once you get to the third toaster, it's now hitting a point of very significantly reduced utility, because that toaster is going to be occupying a lot of space and it's very rarely going to be used. And that goes on so forth for the 4th, the 5th, the 6th toaster, upon which they, it's reaching zero. Eventually it's going to provide no additional utility. So how does that concept apply to 40k? Well, kind of obvious, right? When you have building an army in 40k, you obviously want diversity. And if you have too many of the same thing, then you're not going to be having diversity. And it then will hamper or reduce your ability to deal with a variety of threats. So I know Nick Nanavati in his articles recently did an article that touched on this point in kind of a different way. He kind of said that, that spamming is bad. And this is kind of the reverse way of looking at it, by saying that, well, the reason why spamming is bad is because every extra unit you have of the same type is going to have diminishing marginal utility. So that first thud gun you have is really good because it's a barrage weapon and it allows you to do really cool things like interact with models you can't see and shoot long range and et cetera, et cetera. The second thud gun, still pretty good. The third thud gun, great. But once you've got 10 of them in your army, 9 of them in your army, you've now, each extra thud gun is going to have reduced utility. Not only because the stat line of the thud gun becomes less relevant as you kill models with the original ones, but also because maybe you'll run out of things to shoot as well. And you might want something else. You might want las cannons instead. You might want like forward heavy bolters or something. There's different things you might want. So that's a concept that definitely applies in 40k. And to just give a little bit of balance to that, there's another term that you might hear around called redundancy. And I'll just add that in here. Because these are, excuse me, these are kind of at odds because they actually are suggesting different things. So some people talk about redundancy in an army. Redundancy is the concept that you should have multiple things in an army that can achieve the same thing, so that if one of your units, thud guns or whatever, dies, you can lean on that replacement, the second unit. So balancing the concept of diminishing marginal utility with redundancy is probably one of the hardest parts about list building. You can't build a list and have one form of shooting that has heavy anti-tank firepower and that be the only one in your army. Because if your opponent takes it out, you have no way to interact with tanks and heavy units. So thinking about that, thinking about those economic terms is a really important way of working out how you're going to balance your army. When have you taken too many things that fit the same bill? Okay, the next point, we're getting tougher and tougher as we go through. The next term, excuse me, is absolute and comparative advantages and disadvantages. So I've got a definition here of all these terms. So I'm just going to read it out and then I'll kind of give my example of what it is. And I think this is the most important point that I'm trying to make about economics in 40k. It says that the producer that requires a smaller quantity of inputs to produce a good is said to have an absolute advantage in producing that good. Comparative advantage refers to the ability of a party to produce a particular good or service at a lower opportunity cost than another. Opportunity cost refers to a benefit that a producer could have received but gave up in order to produce a different good. So, it's written there. I mean, you probably can't read it because the video will be really small, but go back and listen to it again if it's a bit complex. But effectively what it means is that absolute advantage is when you can produce something at a smaller quantity or more efficiently. I'm going to use the term efficiently a little bit here as well. When you can produce something more efficiently than someone else, you have an absolute advantage. So for example, let's say Japan, like Toyota can produce cars more efficiently with less inputs than Holden. Toyota has an absolute advantage at producing cars. And that's probably a true statement. Now, what about comparative advantage? Comparative advantage is if Holden more efficiently can produce a Commodore than a different car than they have, than a different brand. I mean, the fact that I can't think of a second Holden is pretty bad, but if they're producing one car more efficiently than another, they have a comparative advantage at producing that product. So if you've got a farmer, I'll use a different example just to help get us through. If you've got a farmer and he's got a farm with apples and pears, if he produces apples, if apples are producing more profit and he's producing them more efficiently than he is producing pears, then he has a comparative advantage in apples. But if a different farmer in a different state, let's say in a different country or a different state, is producing apples at even cheaper than him, then that other farmer has an absolute advantage at producing apples. So even though the farmer we're talking about, our local farmer, has got a comparative advantage in his kind of little sphere at producing apples, there's a different farmer somewhere else that's producing them even more efficiently. Therefore, that farmer has an absolute advantage. So it is possible for different parties to have, you can have a comparative advantage, but still be at an absolute disadvantage. So these terms are quite, I guess they're a little bit technical. And of course, the opportunity cost is something as well that we have to think about, which is what could be produced instead. When he produces the pear, maybe he should have produced the apple. So the opportunity cost of producing the pear is producing an apple. So the logic there is that if he has a comparative advantage of producing apples, why is he producing pears? There has to be a reason for that. So how do we transport these economic thoughts and theory into 40k? And I think the best way to think about these terms is to consider the concept of internal and external list balance. So a lot of codexes have what they have in their codex, and then people will compare what they have in their codex to what's in another codex. And that can create a lot of emotional reflex decisions and a lot of reactions that aren't really good for your list building. And I'm trying to think of a great example here. Let's look at something like assault from deep strike. A couple of the best assault from deep strike options in the game are like bloodletters, or let's say gene stealers from like GSC, or whether they're using a swarm lord to come up and they come up and then the swarm lord double moves them in. They're some of the best units to assault from deep strike. So if you're playing an army like Blood Angels or Grey Knights or Raven Guard or any army that's not demons or gene stealer like Tyranids, then you have potentially, depending on the argument that you could have, but you have a absolute disadvantage at deep strike, assaulting from deep strike. And the reason you have an absolute disadvantage is because another codex can just simply do it better than you. If you're playing Ultramarines and you're deep striking Vanguard Vets or Blood Angels, whatever you are, then you simply aren't as efficient as a Bloodletter Bomb or as Gene Stealers coming up with Cult Ambush, because they're cheaper, they're hitting harder, they can move further, they can do so many more things than you can. So they're just better than you. You're at an absolute disadvantage. But you may be at a comparative advantage in your codex. So just because a Bloodletter Bomb or a Gene Stealer Bomb is better than your Death Company coming down and assaulting, obviously does not mean that you should not be running your Death Company. Because Death Company are at a massive comparative advantage in a Blood Angels codex. They are one of the best things in the codex, especially when you consider the strategies and the things that can buff them. So even though you're at a comparative even though you're at an absolute disadvantage at something, does not mean you should not take it or you should not play it, because you're probably at a comparative advantage. So the concept of what I'm saying here is maximize your comparative advantages, okay? Don't think about the big picture. If you're playing a specific codex, don't think about just because someone else can do it better than you doesn't mean it's not your best option, all right? I'm about to build and play like a Grey Knights for this season. I'm at almost an absolute disadvantage at anything I think about. Any unit I take in Grey Knights is pretty much at an absolute disadvantage to something else out there in the world, in the 40k codex system. But doesn't mean that there aren't specific strengths I have in my codex that I need to emphasize in order to build a strong army. So even though Strike Marines might simply not be as good as something like, you know, Raven Guard, Stern Guard, or other things that can come down and shoot lots of shots, whatever, Elysians, whatever we want to talk about, they are still probably the best unit in the Grey Knight Codex. So I should be building lots of Strike Marines. Just to build on this a little bit more, and this kind of idea, there is a really important thing that occurs in the world economy, the global economy, that really dictates and influences the effects of absolute and comparative advantages. And those things are trade, when you're trading. So if you've got a farmer that has an absolute disadvantage at for example, absolute disadvantage at apples, so he's not producing apples as efficiently. So a farmer in Australia is not producing apples as efficiently as a farmer in the United States. That doesn't really matter if the cost of trade is going to offset that disadvantage. So effectively what we're saying here is sometimes it's irrelevant. So that kind of, that's the way of thinking about my point, in that you can't get a unit. If you're playing Blood Angels, you can't ally in a Bloodletter Bomb. You can't trade with demons. And because you can't trade with demons, you should not be thinking about them. So when a farmer in Australia is, working out his resources, working out his economics, he should not be thinking about parts, industries and countries that do not trade with Australia and that their costs don't work. He should be thinking about countries that free trade with Australia. So if the United States free trade, or if there's another country that free trades, then that now becomes a direct competitor that he has to factor into his decisions. So the point is, I guess, there are some armies in 40k that have free trade agreements, so to speak. And those armies are the soups, right? So things like Chaos, Imperium, Eldari, they all have the ability to ally in units from other codexes at almost no cost to their own army. So if you, for example, are looking at Blood Angels and you're saying to yourself, you know what, I'm looking at my codex. I have a comparative disadvantage. Sorry, I have an absolute disadvantage in my codex to devastators from a different, like Imperial Fist devastators, for example, or a different type of heavy weapon platform, like a thud gun from Space Marines. Blood Angels can't take thud guns. Another army can take them. They're simply better than something I can take. Well, you can free trade with that faction. So you've got no reason not to ally in that thud gun. So when the way you have to think about things is, well, internal and external codex balance is a really complex complex kind of situation where ultimately you have to be looking at the soups as one big country, one big economy. So, you know, when you're looking down at your Seraphim, if you're playing Sisters of Battle and you're looking at Seraphim and you think, you know what, Seraphim aren't very good. Maybe having one unit's good so I can active faith it, maybe 2 units for active faith, but I want to have a really fast Sisters army. And you know what, Seraphim aren't amazing. I wish I had Death Company. Well, you actually can have a unit of Death Company in your Sisters army if you want. Because of the fact that there's that free trade situation going. You can ally in a patrol detachment, or you can take a very cheap Blood Angels battalion, get in a big unit of Death Company. There is your, you know, you're pulling and you're leveraging the advantage that Blood Angels have as far as your internal soup goes. Okay, so there's some economic terms. Now, how do you incorporate some of these thought processes into your 40k list building? How do you remove emotion and improve your economic and rational thinking? Well, the best way to do that, I would say, is to write a list for a new army. An army that you don't, either an army that is totally different, or just a totally new codex that you've never played before. So if you're a Space Marine player, maybe write an Eldar list. Or if you're an Eldar player, you know, maybe write a Sisters of Battle list. And by writing a list for something that's totally new, you're not going in with any emotional skews. You're not going in with any kind of polluted waters from the past that might affect your decision making when you're looking at these unit types. So this is just a fun exercise for people as well. Sometimes it's just good to do. And I've done this in the past. Sometimes, like, I'll have no intention of playing Tyranids, or I'll have no intention of playing, you know, a different faction, but I'll write a list for that faction anyway, just to see what they can do and test my own objective decision making as well. See if I can come up with the sources of power in a codex that the meta is coming up with and the meta thinks is good. And it can be a really good way of testing your own decision making. The next way to do it is to don't think about the fluff lore or models of a specific unit when you consider it. So a great example of this is a little story I'll tell about the top two. Myself, I won CanCon this year, and Lee Abbey, who's also a Victorian player, lives from Melton, but he came second. So Victoria took home 1 and 2 this year, and me and Lee played, I think, around 5 or something. So it was just over halfway into the event, and I beat Lee relatively comprehensively. But Lee messaged me recently, and like we chat a lot and we talk, and he messaged me and said, "Hey dude, I can't believe I overlooked this specific thing for my army list at CanCon. I should have had Saint Celestine in my army." And then we kind of discussed it and you know, came to the realization, which Lee had already come to, that Saint Celestine would have simply been a superior, amazing unit in his army. He didn't have Saint Celestine in kind of an Imperial soup style list, and it would have just really helped him. She would have been amazing, right? And he kind of, one of the reasons he didn't take Saint Celestine was because he just didn't like the lore of Saint Celestine. I don't know if it was, you know, whether he doesn't like the Jeanne d'Arc kind of theme, or whether he doesn't, you know, like the fact that she went from being a modest kind of model to this ridiculously, you know, insane powerhouse. Whatever reason it was, Lee kind of emotionally dismissed Saint Celestine when he was writing his list and just left her aside and didn't think about her when he was writing the list. And I said to Lee, you know what? I'm pretty lucky because I was doing the same thing for months leading up to CanCon. For about almost all of 8th edition, especially after the Codex, I was not using Shining Spears in my Ynnari list. I was running Ynnari with primarily Dark Reapers. The reason why I wasn't using Shining Spears is because I don't like Shining Spears. I've never liked the idea of Eldar on bikes with melee weapons. They just seem silly to me. You know, and in the past, for multiple editions, as far as I've been concerned, they've been really terrible. And I don't have the models either, right? I don't have Shining Spears models. I've got a pretty huge Eldar collection, but I simply don't have Shining Spears. So I had this emotional block stopping me from thinking about Shining Spears for months, because the Codex came out about 3 months or so before CanCon. And I was really lucky because about 2 weeks or 3 weeks before lists were due, I was having a discussion with a bunch of people at Dean's place, and we were talking, and he said, and it came up, we're talking about Shining Spears, it came up in discussion, and I that emotional block went off in my head where I said, stuff those things, we don't like Shining Spears. But then I went home and I looked at the Codex entry again, and this was a couple of weeks before the list was due, and I realized how busted Shining Spears were. I saw them with a new light. It was this kind of epiphany for me about, wow, these things are insane. They're so cheap. They're so good. Look how good they are. Look what they can do. They shoot. I didn't realize they kept the twin shuriken catapult. And then I just thought to myself, well, I have to have a unit in my CanCon list. And I made it work. I ended up converting up some of my normal Wind Riders. I put spears on them so they became Shining Spears for the event. So what I'm trying to say is that even at the top tables of tournaments, so these are the people that came first, second, and it almost happens across the board. People are making emotional missteps when they're list building. And a lot of that is based on that kind of a reluctance to commit to a model based on its fluff lore or the model itself. So in the case that you don't like a model, don't dismiss it. If there's someone like, and say Celestine is a good example, because I could imagine a lot of people wouldn't like the fact that she's this ridiculous superhero now and that she always comes back and this, that. You don't have to have Saint Celestine. You can use Saint Celestine in your army, but you can convert the models to be exactly the same dimensions, but be a different story. So for example, for myself, I'm considering using Celestine in my Grey Knights army that I'm building. And I've come up with the idea of using, instead of having Celestine in her 2 Germanae, I was going to have kind of a high, for my chapter, like a high chaplain. So an Astrath kind of figure. Not Astrath himself, but like a really kind of revered chaplain as Celestine. And her 2 Germanae I would convert to be Eralim, which are in the Blood Angels lore. They're kind of very dark, secretive, sanguinary guard style chaplains. So they're like the elite guard for chaplains. And I would convert 2 Eralim up using kind of chaplain models with jump packs and wings. And then I would make my Celestine via like a big kind of Astrath style model with a sword and maybe like flowing hair or something like that. So I can have Celestine in my army, even though I don't really like her fluff. I don't really like the super, the way the models look currently. I mean, I think they're cool, but they don't fit the kind of aesthetic I want in my army. So it is possible, despite that emotional disconnect, to still be optimizing your army lists, and you really should be doing it. Lastly, introduce yourself to some basic math hammer. It can be daunting, but as I said towards the earlier part of the video, just start small. Just work out how do bolters fare against this unit and how do bolters fare against that unit. If I said to you, do bolters kill more orc boys or do they kill more, nurgling bases? Like, which is more efficient? What are they more efficient against? Like, I don't know if you could come up with the answer straight away, because nurgling bases are only toughness 2, right? I think. Maybe, like, you've got to do the maths. Like, get a spreadsheet out, do the maths. Once you start doing it and start, like, familiarizing yourself with basic kind of spreadsheets and stuff, it'll then just flow a lot easier, and it'll be something you'll access and be more willing to dabble with going into the future. So that rounds out my video, guys. Emotions versus economics in 40k. I hope some of these concepts, that I referred to, efficiency, diminishing, marginal, utility, absolute and comparative advantage, disadvantage, and opportunity cost, I hope that they help to, think about it, think about 40k armies in a different way, because you can think about the 40k universe as a big economy. And when we are building our armies, we are investing in different countries, so to speak, or different businesses, and we are trading with other ones as well. So thanks, guys, and see you for my next video, which will be a response to the FAQ that should be coming out really soon. So cheers.